saying that we need to parent by faith or parent the Lord's way. I'm not suggesting that there is nothing out there that's written by anybody else that could give us some good advice. But I am suggesting this. We must never, ever forget that the expert on not only parenting, but the expert on everything has written by inspiration a book for us that's filled with documents that help us understand what God's wisdom is, and we need to follow that wisdom. And I'm going to say that strongly this morning. And those of you who are parents, do not forget that. I don't care what you're reading, and I don't care what somebody else is saying. Don't forget that what you need to follow is what God said. And I want to remind us of that today. I'm not going to tell you anything new. But I do want to remind you of what I believe may be slipping away. I know from our culture generally, I know that. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But it may very well be that those of us who profess to be people of God are spending too much of our time paying attention to others. And we're not paying attention to what God says in reference to what He wants us to be as parents and even as children. And those who have this most important relationship, or at least a very important relationship as it relates to our earthly associations. So let's notice this passage as we think about from Psalm 127. I want you to think, I'm going to call this lesson Archers and Arrows. And I think as we read this text, you're going to understand. And I'm going to make this point pretty strong this morning. So I'm just going to tell you ahead of time that I'm going to make it pretty strong. Psalm 127, this is what probably a psalm that should be attributed to Solomon. It depends on really possibly David. They would say, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so He gives His beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of an archer, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. There's a lot in here. I'm going to focus on really one aspect of the passage. But there are several things that I think would be worthy of us to think about. That children are a heritage from the Lord. They, in essence, are a reward. They are given to us so that we can help them. And it's God's design. God is the one who has determined that. And so we must understand His design, and we therefore need to do what is best to help them in every way. How do we direct and how do we raise our children? And I want to again say that it's best for us to not forget what other so-called experts have said, and us focus on what God says. And so I want to do that this morning for a moment. The imagery here that he uses, he says, like arrows in the hand of an archer. Some of your translations may say warrior. The imagery is of archery. It's of arrows, who would be our children, and of those of us who are archers, those of us who would be parents. And I want you to think about the analogy. Archers and arrows. Why does he use that? Think about that. An archer prepares to launch an arrow. He places it between his fingers and he steadies himself. But before he does all of that, he already has a target picked out. He's already thinking about where he wants that arrow to land. And so the point of picking it up and the point of pulling it back and holding it steady and eyeing it is because you have a target out there that you want that arrow to achieve. That's the point, it seems to me, of that analogy. So parents, you and I are archers that have a target in mind. And in essence, our children are arrows. They are God's arrows. And part of our parenting problem, it seems to me, is that there is lack of forethought and planning in the target. We understand the analogy of an arrow. We understand that we have some influence, that we pull back. But the point that I want to make to you this morning is that there is a target there. That's the point here, I think, that he makes. And we have targets for them. But sometimes, folks, our targets are not the most important targets. What I'm about to say can be hard to hear. But it is needful. It's needful everywhere. It's needful here. It's needful for me to be reminded of. But so sometimes as parents, I want to just share some things with you. We target a lot of different things that aren't the target that I think the Lord intends for us to target. We're in essence shooting our children, but we've got them aimed at the wrong thing. We sometimes want them to be popular among our peers and among their peers. We want them to have friends. We want them to be popular. And all of us have a sense about that. We don't want them to be misfits, and we don't want them to be unsocial. We want them to have that kind of influence. But how many of us make that some sort of emphasis? And that is such a fleeting thing. I mean, if anything is vanity, it's popularity of peers, isn't it? And yet, we put so much energy and effort into somehow making that so important. And it's such a fleeting thing. Or we stress possibly academic status and academic ability, and certainly aptitude and the ability to gain and retain and to implement knowledge. Certainly that's a wonderful thing. God's given us a mind. He's asked us to reason. But the essence of what we know and what we become, and even our occupations, I mean, that's fleeting. As important in its proper perspective as that is an important thing. I mean, many of you this morning are here, and part of why you're here in this area is because you are bettering and helping yourself educationally. That's a great thing. It's a necessary thing in many cases. But that's not going to last long. It's not. And so that cannot be, not the essence, not the primary target. That may be a target for you, and if it is, I want you to achieve that. But if that's the primary target you have right now, you've missed the point. And one thing that affects so many of our kids, frankly, is we want them to achieve some athletic prowess. So some ability to achieve on the field or on the court, or in various other kinds of places where competition is there. Listen, you know me, I love that stuff. But that's not what it's about. That's been a part of my life for a very long time, and to some degree still is. I can still jump this high. But I'm going to tell you, if that's where you think it is, you have lost it. That is not where it is. Those things are fleeting, and they are fleeting quickly. And we all have to understand that. That is not the target. Or sometimes we aim for our children to have these material possessions. And sometimes the way we raise them, we've encouraged that by our own lifestyles. But I want to tell you, you ask people today in Houston, Texas, if over the past few days or weeks, if their attitude toward what they have has changed. I will tell you that probably if you ask some folks in Florida right now, you'll get some differences of opinion as opposed to 24 hours ago. The writer of Ecclesiastes, he makes it clear. And I think we misunderstand that sometimes. He says vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He is not, and I stress this because it is true. He's not saying that they're meaningless. That sometimes that word is used as meaningless. I don't believe that's what he's saying in Ecclesiastes. I don't think he's saying it's meaningless. All those things are not meaningless. Some of the things that I've discussed this morning, they are important to us. They're important to me. But what the wisdom writer is saying is, it's not that they're meaningless, but he's saying they're not going to last long. And that's true. They don't. Those feelings that come upon us because of things that we achieve or because of things that we accomplish. Those feelings may come, but those feelings go as quickly as they come. Because that's not where we get our ultimate achievement. That's not what life is really about. That really isn't the target that the Lord wants to build. We may not, as parents, we may not target heaven for them. And what we've got to do, folks, we've got to reevaluate what our targets are. And may I say this? Not targeting heaven. Listen carefully to this. Not targeting heaven for your children is the very worst kind of child abuse. It's the worst kind. As bad as all other kinds are, and they are bad, horrific. But not targeting and not helping your children begin to achieve spiritual success is the worst kind of child abuse. And so there is this urgency about all of this because we've got them for such a short time. We may have some ability to affect their lives for longer periods of time, but they're not in our home except for a short time. And so we have to make all the years count. I look into this audience and see children of all ages who are pliable. The younger ones, boy, they'll do just anything their parents say for the most part. That'll change, folks. Yeah, it won't last all their lives. But they're pliable now and they can be helped now. And those magical teenage years can be thrilling or they can be killing. Depending on a lot of times about what happens in those early years. And you say, well, Kenny, how do you know that? Just look around you. Just observe. Lessons of life many times are learned, not because we're told, but when we are. The Lord tells us about a lot of those, but because we just observe. And I think that's part of what the wisdom literature says. I think that's part of what Proverbs is about. Just look around you. You can figure a lot of this out, but I think the wisdom writer says, let me tell you about it, but then just watch. You be perceptive yourself and see if that's not the case. And so, for this short amount of time that we have, we've got to do the very best we can. And I will be the first to tell you. That is not easy. And no one's perfect. And I will tell you, I've seen bad parents produce great kids. And I've seen great parents produce terrible kids. And there are a lot of factors in all of that. But the responsibility of those of us who have children is critically important in that process, and we need to be reminded that we need to let our faith in God dictate how we parent, not somebody in the world dictating that. So let me mention this morning 3 things to you that I think are critically important as targets. So these are just reminders, just 3 things. It won't take long for me to get through these things. And I want to first of all mention this to you. We need to be people who love our children. And you would say, well, that's pretty obvious. I'm talking about love them biblically. You say, well, all parents love their children. And to borrow a line from Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. Everybody may say they love their children. But I don't think all parents love their children biblically. When I read a passage like 1 Corinthians 13, that tells me, I think it gives the essence of what love is about, yes. And it shows us how to love all men biblically, and that includes our children. And it does say that you need to be patient, yes. You need to be kind, yes. You need never be rude, absolutely. But then it says that you always seek what is best. Think about that. You always seek what is best. And I'm going to tell you that always seeking what is best for your children does not always meet with grand approval by those you're trying to influence. Matter of fact, young people, children, parents, teenagers, college students, wherever you are in the spectrum, you understand this. That godly parents who are trying to help you are doing it because they love you, not because they hate you. But they're doing it because they do understand that they're seeking what is in your best interest spiritually. Hopefully that target is on heaven and not focused on those other things. Those other things, are nothing wrong with those. But if the focus is not heaven, then we have in essence missed the point. And giving our children what he or she wants may very well be unloving. It may directly go against what God wants from us. And so we need to love them biblically. And I'm going to add to that our culture is going to be against that for the most part. Our culture, in a lot of ways, is anti-biblical. And so for culture to dictate how we love them and for us to dictate how we love them biblically may be two different things. Maybe some of the things are similar, but in essence, a lot of that's going to be different. We have to decide, how am I going to love them? So love them biblically. I'm going to say it to you that way. Don't love them the way the world would oftentimes tell us. Love them biblically. And understand what that means. And then I'm going to suggest that we need to be willing to discipline them. Take your Bible and just turn to Proverbs 13, please. This is a short statement. Most of the Proverbs are. But notice this. He who spares his rods hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. I want to read this again. Whoever spares his rod, you ready? Hates his son. That's not a typo. That's not a misprint. Well, what is the wisdom writer saying? The wisdom writer is saying if a parent is unwilling to discipline a child, by God's definition, you hate your children. Well, think about it. If you are unwilling to discipline your child, you hate your child. Don't spare. He says, don't spare the rod. That doesn't mean that every time a child misbehaves, he needs a spanking. But spankings are good, folks. And we get in trouble many times because we live in a world that disregards that altogether. Well, of course, all of this has to do with being disciplined ourselves and understanding what's good about a situation and what's right about punishment. Obviously, it's always been that way. But don't listen to experts, listen to God. He is the expert. Listen to what He says. This whole idea of discipline has to do with having principles and having boundaries. That's the idea. The derivative of that word is disciples. Discipline and disciples. It'll have to do with the same family of words. That has to do staying within boundaries and enforcing those boundaries. A disciple of Jesus is someone who disciplines himself to stay within the boundaries that the teacher, that the master has determined. That's what discipline is. There's an instructive element to it as well as there is another element of punishment and reward. There's another element to all of that. And so we must understand that we need to enforce these boundaries that God has given and help our children learn those things. And if you're here this morning and you want to take issue with that, don't take issue with me. Take issue with God, and good luck doing that. Good luck doing that. I'm not the one who decided we ought to have kids, nor did you. It was God who decided that. And it was God who decided that what you need to do is discipline your children. Help them in that way. And then, finally, let me just mention this. We need to train them. This passage which Brad read for us, we need to bring them up. Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. There's a balance here. There are extremes that can be gone to. But don't provoke them, but bring them up. Raise them. Bring them up in the discipline, there you go, or the instruction and admonition of the Lord. Boundaries. teaching. Now, there's a lot that can be said about that. I'm not preaching this lesson this morning because I want to present a whole lesson on how to train the children. I just want to remind us that what Paul says is that we don't need to provoke our children. But, he says, we need to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I will tell you, as a father, that's one of the hardest things that I've ever done. You would say, well, how is that hard? Well, it's hard. Let me tell you, you ask any parent, you ask any father or mother if that's not a hard thing to do. Because many times what we're doing is we're fighting other influences in the lives of our children who are saying things really, in essence, against what we're trying to tell them. Whose parents are establishing for other children a different target. Well, they're going in this direction, but we ought to be going in another direction. We ought to be aiming for this spiritual target that we have out there. And sometimes when people aren't helping you and other influences aren't helping you, that's a very difficult thing. I can't think of a harder thing in my life than being a parent. But I want to remind you this morning that as parents, don't allow the world to raise your kids. They will. If you let them, they will. And if you whether you make a deliberate decision to allow that or not, they're going to if you don't. Somebody is going to raise them. Somebody is going to kind of have the influence over them. And the responsibility of that, according to Psalm 127, is given to parents. And we need to be willing to do that. If we don't do that, folks, they'll be misguided. And they'll be ill prepared for the target that all of us want them to achieve. That's it. I want to remind you of those things. And here's the thing. Here's the thing. If you could say, well, Kenny, what is it that you've talked about a few different things. What is it that you want us to remember? Remember this. Aim for the right target. And let everything you do be pointed in that direction with your children. Think about what God said and do what He said. Help encourage them. Listen, I'm not naive enough to think that there won't be difficulties. And I know that from personal experience, and I know that from observation. But as a parent, what you want more than anything else is to do your very best to do it God's way by what He's told us. And may God help all of us to do that. I am especially mindful this morning of those of you here who are younger parents or who will become parents, of the difficulty that you may face or are facing, but may I encourage you to always put your trust and confidence in the good Lord. He is the one who can help you the most. And as always, our prayer is always that all of our children, everywhere and anywhere, will be raised, as we commonly say, in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. May God help us toward that end. If you have a spiritual need this morning, we're going to sing an invitation song, which Rye will lead. And if that needs something that we can help you with, make that known by coming forward as we stand.